Hey guys, welcome to today's episode where I'm going to react to a recent podcast with PBD. Now, if you guys don't know PBD from Valuetainment, Patrick Bet-David, he's someone actually I watch from time to time. And he recently had on a physician named Peter Gøtzsche. Now, if you don't know who Peter Gøtzsche is, he's a internist physician by training who basically is a pharma whistleblower. He, criticizes big pharma. And so PBD had him on to talk about the pharmaceutical industry. He goes on to ask him a lot of questions about the pharma industry, vaccines, depression, SSRIs, which are used for treating depression. Some of the controversial comments that Peter has made, for example, about mammograms and using that as a diagnostic for breast cancer and how he's against it. So he has a lot of controversial claims. And what I want to do is kind of talk about really my thoughts and my reaction to this video, because there was a lot of misinformation and a lot of information that I think was just false, plain false. All right. So the first thing that Peter Gøtzsche mentions is the fact that the pharmaceutical industry is an organized crime. They're an organized crime industry. So let's take a look and see what he says about that.
I went out on the internet and I Googled the 10 biggest drug companies in the world, and I found out that they had committed serious crimes repeatedly and had been fined sometimes billions of dollars. But it's a tiny bit actually compared to what they earned by their crimes, which is why the crimes just continue. And according to US law, the Racketeering Act, organized crime is about doing things repeatedly, which can be fraud, and that is all over the place, both in research and marketing, bribery, political corruption, obstruction of justice, embezzlement. So these are things that you can see the big pharma companies do all the time.
So as you can see here, he mentions the pharmaceutical industry, talking about the fact that the industry, similar to the mob, is involved in racketeering. And I think, when Patrick David asks him why, around 5 minutes into the interview, he says he Googles it and he sees that they have a lot of fines and penalties. And that's true. Pharmaceutical companies do have a lot of fines and penalties, but that certainly does not make them an organized crime industry or mafia. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about this. And first, I think before I answer this, let's understand really who Peter Gøtzsche is. As I mentioned, he's a physician by training, and he worked, at least according to Wikipedia, for about 9 years for a company called Astra B, which was a Swedish pharmaceutical company at the time. Later in 1999, they merged with a British company called Zeneca to become what's known as today AstraZeneca, very well known pharmaceutical company. But regardless, his role there was a sales rep. He was a product manager. He wasn't involved in clinical trials or medical affairs. At that time, really, there wasn't medical affairs. And he was there from 1977, it looks like, to about 1984. And this is well before a lot of the changes that happened in the pharmaceutical industry occurred. And I want to kind of talk about that a little bit because, and I mentioned this before in some other videos, but the pharmaceutical industry in the last 15 years has undergone a lot of changes, and the biggest change being the implementation of the Pharma Code. The Pharma Code. And the Pharma Code is a code, a voluntary code that pharma companies adopt. They don't have to do it, they adopt it voluntarily in terms of how they interact with healthcare providers and what they can and cannot do with healthcare providers. And so it's like a code that basically puts restrictions on what the pharmaceutical companies can do when they're talking to doctors, basically, right? And so one of the things, for example, if they can do is bribe a doctor. They can't give them items of value. So, for example, even giving them a pen, with the drug's name on it. Now you can't do that. Now, back in Peter Gøtzsche's day, I'm sure that you could do a lot of that stuff. So I think part of his impression of the pharmaceutical industry kind of being the wild, wild west back then is based on maybe some of his experiences as a sales rep. But today, the pharmaceutical industry is much, much more compliant. Okay. So I think that's one thing, at least from my perspective, that I thought was a little misleading to say that they're an organized crime. Again, he was there for a few years. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for 18 years, and I can tell you that they are extremely compliant. They take ethics and compliance very, very seriously. In the work that I do as the founder of ACMA, we've worked with almost 1,000 pharmaceutical companies, and they're really, really big on making sure that there's competencies and standards for their pharmaceutical sales reps, their medical science liaisons who go out and interact with doctors, so forth and so on. He says, for example, that the FDA is bribed by the industry, doctors are bribed by the industry, and he's saying as if it's legal to do that, and it's not. It's a violation of the anti-kickback law. As a matter of fact, some of those fines that he's referring to that are in the billions, that's true. They have been fined, but that was because you had some bad actors. It's not like it's a policy of the company, and 99% of the time to go out and do this. And there are some companies that had done this. They're not really no longer in business. I'm not going to name who they are. They were involved in the pain space, but those are smaller companies that were kind of renegade companies. Some of those senior executives, I've talked about this in other videos, went to jail. But this is not something that's like condoned or, encouraged in the pharmaceutical industry. Again, most of the people that work in the pharmaceutical industry, they are really trying to do the right thing. So from my perspective, I'd have a lot of pause in going so far as to say that the industry is an organized crime. I just don't think that's true. I haven't seen that. And again, most of the people that work in the pharmaceutical industry, even at the highest levels, I was an executive there, they really are trying to do the right thing by patients. If they see something with the data that's a concern, they'll stop the study. They'll inform the people that are involved in the study. They'll inform the patients that there's a lot of things that are in place when we're designing clinical trials. So I just think, again, this is probably not true. Now, the other thing he talks about later on in the video is how pharma pays doctors to be advisors and consultants. And that's true. And I can tell you from experience that doesn't make physicians write scripts, though. So, right, he's trying to basically say it's a quid pro quo that the pharmaceutical companies, we pay a doctor to be a speaker. And then we expect that doctor in return to write a prescription. But that actually, again, is not true. Matter of fact, as the founder of the ACMA, one of our roles is to establish standards for the pharmaceutical industry around, for example, building speaker programs and how they go about building these speaker programs, which are programs where the physicians are trained as speakers for, a particular drug, for example. And so there's a lot of things that are in place. One of the things is you can't pick a speaker based on prescription volume or on the fact that they're going to write a prescription. You just can't do that. And the thing is, many industries use thought leaders as advisors, as speakers, as consultants to propagate their cause. Many industries do that. A lot of the influencers, right? They're out there, they're peddling a product or encouraging the use of a certain product. You can argue they're thought leaders. So this is not something that is unique to the pharmaceutical industry. It's something that happens all the time. Okay, so again, I just want to put that in context. So the other thing that he talks about later is direct-to-consumer advertising. And Patrick McDavid, to his credit, asked a good question. He says, "Look, New Zealand, America, they're the only ones that are using commercials right now that go directly to patients, drug commercials." And then he says that in the EU it's handled differently. But then later he says that pharma does business all the same throughout the world. And really his later point is correct. The pharmaceutical industry, by and large, they operate the same everywhere. Again, we've worked with pharmaceutical companies in over 80 countries, and I can tell you that by and large their operating system is the same. There are some cultural and regulatory differences based on the regulatory health authorities or bodies in those countries. For example, in America, you have the FDA. In Europe, you have the EMA. In Saudi Arabia, you have the Saudi FDA, or in Canada, you have Health Canada, so forth and so on. So there are some differences there, but by and large, it's pretty much the same. The pharma companies operate similarly within the bounds of the law. Bribing is just simply not allowed. Now, am I going to say that no one does that? There might be situations where, they're bribing officials, but it's not like a policy of the company, or it's not something where the company encourages it. Matter of fact, what I've seen is the opposite, where pharmaceutical companies will actually get, will fire someone if they engage in that type of activity. So I just haven't seen that. Now, when it comes to direct-to-consumer advertising, I want to talk about that a little bit because I know that there's a lot of controversy about that. And, for a lot of people that don't like the pharmaceutical industry, the position is, that the companies are directly marketing to the patients, which causes the patients to go in and say, hey, I saw this medication on the TV and I want it. And the doctor's just going to write it. That's not really what happens. Again, but I will tell you that there is a value of directly advertising the consumers for certain diseases where these diseases aren't being diagnosed. And I've been in situations where I've worked on therapeutic areas where the diagnosis for a particular disease is very, very low because there's low awareness. There's low awareness. So when the company encourages someone to ask their doctor about a particular set of symptoms they have or whatever, I see that as actually empowering the patient. It empowers the patient. It gives the patient a voice to go in and say, I think I might have this issue, or I saw this, and is this an option? Let's talk about it. And the doctor will discuss that with the patient. Again, most doctors are going to do the right thing. They're not just going to prescribe the product nilly willy because the patient asked about it. That's highly, highly unlikely. So I don't think that that's something that I would be too concerned about. Now, if we did away with commercials, will that impact pharma companies much? To be honest, I don't think so, because most of the time pharmaceutical companies get the word out there through getting medical education programs, which they sponsor. He talks about that later in the video, and I'll get to that. But also pharmaceutical sales rep, of which he was a pharmaceutical sales rep. I was a pharmaceutical sales rep years ago. And we go out there, we're assigned territories, and we talk to these doctors about these drugs. And of course, the medical science liaisons. So it's a lot of communication that occurs kind of in an omni-channel approach through different routes that they market and sell and educate doctors on. Now, later on, he goes on to say that drugs, and this I particularly had a problem with this, drugs shorten the lives of Americans or the lives of people, meaning they increase mortality rates because of overdiagnosis and overtreatment with drugs. And then one of the things I took issue with PBD, he says it's not disputable. That's just something that is accepted. So I take exception to that because I'm not really sure where that data comes from, to be honest. If you look at the data and you look at life expectancy in 1959 in the U.S., life expectancy was about 70 years old. Now, by 2016, average life expectancy is 79 years old, or 78.9. So life expectancy went up about 10 years. And I would say, from my standpoint, pharma companies, and not from my standpoint, I would just say in general, look at the data, it's not really disputable that pharma companies have helped with preventing many, many, many diseases and treating many diseases, in particular infectious diseases. If you think about the types of diseases that pharmaceutical companies have helped to prevent, I mean, the biggest one, polio, right? I mean, they came out with the polio vaccine that pretty much eradicated it in most of the world. Another one, smallpox, right? That again has been eradicated. HIV/AIDS used to be a death sentence. Now it's highly treatable with these antiretroviral therapies. One of the companies I work for, which I'm proud of, Gilead Sciences, helped to and AbbVie helped to bring important therapies for HIV and AIDS. Hepatitis C. Hepatitis C used to be a disease that you would end up getting hepatocellular carcinoma or liver cancer, and now you can get cure rates up to 95%. Tuberculosis, a lot of bacterial infections, pneumonia, meningitis, sepsis, HPV, there's a vaccine for that. Then that's just only that area, right? The infectious diseases. But now you're talking about metabolic diseases, diabetes. Before insulin was discovered in 1921, type 1 diabetes was fatal within months. Now patients can live a normal lifespan. Hypothyroidism used to be fatal. Now there's thyroid replacement therapies with things like Synthroid, another company that I used to work for, Abbott or AbbVie. Hypercholesterolemia, if you had high cholesterol, you would die from cardiovascular disease. There were drugs like ACE inhibitors and beta blockers and all SGLT2 inhibitors and, all these things, diuretics, blood thinners, which he does talk about later on. So, and then of course there's cancer and a lot of the neurological diseases as well. So, I would really take exception from my standpoint about saying that these drugs cause death. And I'm going to get into kind of how he did that and how he uncovered that. But again, from my standpoint, I think that's a very, very far stretch or a far reach to say that these drugs are, causing death. I think he says they're the number one cause of death. And again, I don't think that's true. Now, some of the things that he does say that I would agree with, for example, PBD asks him about the U.S. in terms of overall mortality versus the Nordic countries. I think he's Swedish, and he says that the U.S. Has more deaths, and that's true. We have more higher mortality rates, but the reason for that is because we have more gun-related deaths, deaths due to mental illness. We have more deaths, for example, related to obesity. Obesity is associated with so many metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, which cardiovascular disease is the number one cause of death. And PBD, to his credit, challenges Peter Gøtzsche on that later on and mentions that. So, yes, we have more mortality, but a lot of it is related to some other things like which are controllable, like gun related deaths. We're actually just a few days after the horrible assassination of Charlie Kirk, and that's an example of a gun related death. And of course, there's many more that don't make the news, but this is something that's terrible, right? And it's something that contributes to the overarching mortality in the U.S. Now, later he talks about family doctors. He mentions, for example, internal medicine physicians. So he's an internal medicine physician. And he says, and this again, I took exception to, that specialists, we should stay at arm's length from specialists. And I'm not sure why he's saying this, and I'm not sure where he's getting this data from. Now, there is data, and this comes up in the podcast that from the Journal of American Medical Association, that having more internists and primary care physicians results in better outcomes. But that doesn't mean that going to more specialists results in higher mortality rates. Remember, going to a specialist, think of a cardiologist, that you go to, they have many more years of training. They're board certified in cardiology and can treat you better. They have a better understanding of the drugs, the surgical procedures. Primary care physicians just can't do that. So I could see the point about having more primary care physicians. Yes, that's true. But I can't see the point of saying that specialists are bad. I disagree. I think they have an important role. And I know actually in the US is a very strong effort to increase the number of primary care healthcare providers, which by the way is not just MDs, but also pharmacists, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants as well. The next thing he talks about are opioids, and he says that the main killers related to the leading cause of death in the U.S. are opioids, Motrin, Advil, which is ibuprofen, and psychiatric drugs. Now, I will say when it comes to opioids, I agree with him there. Opioid misuse and abuse, 100% I agree with that. It's caused a lot of deaths. When it comes to the psychiatric drugs, this is not something that I feel comfortable speaking about. I don't know the data that well, so I'm not going to speak about that. I'm going to kind of stay in my lane related to that. I know that he makes some correlations to the fact that psychiatric drugs like SSRIs cause imbalance. There is data to the fact that these drugs do cause more balance issues, dizziness, etc., leading to about a twofold higher risk of falls. And when you're elderly and you fall, you can fracture your hip. And there is data to show that if you fracture your hip, usually within a year of fracturing your hip, your mortality rate increases significantly. It's like a 50% mortality rate. So that's true. But that's an association. I don't know if it's a causation, meaning we don't know if that's, you can say that SSRIs are the direct cause of hip fractures, right? I don't know if we can say that, right? It's not maybe a direct cause, there's an association with it. And that's very, very different, when you think about causation versus association. So that's key. Now, he mentions again, prescription drugs, the leading cause of death, but actually, according to the CDC, which I know he doesn't believe the CDC is credible, but heart disease is number one, then cancer, and then number three are drugs, but that's related to overdose, guys. It's related to overdose of prescription opioids, illicit fentanyl, heroin, meth, and then a smaller number, about 100,000 deaths a year related to adverse drug events. But I mean, that's 100,000 deaths, very, very low. I mean, even if you combine the overdose and the adverse events, you're still way below cardiovascular disease and cancer. And listen, no drug is perfect, right? I mean, every drug has side effects. And at the end of the day, it's a benefit to risk ratio, right? When we look at the prescribing a product, right, if you're a healthcare provider, you look at the benefit and the risk profile, and you have to determine whether the benefits outweigh the risks, right? And that's a decision you have to make between you and your healthcare provider. Now, his claims come from, according to him, meta-analyses and some systematic reviews. And I just wanted to talk about that for a minute. Actually, if you're listening to this and you're board certified in medical affairs, you've taken the BCMAS program, which is really the standard kind of board certification for MSLs or medical science liaisons. This is something that's covered as we look at different levels of clinical trial evidence in the board certification. You get assessed on that, you're trained on that. And one of the problems, I think, is that he's looking at a lot of underlying randomized controlled trials that are small, short term, or not designed to capture the rare but serious harms. He's also including observational studies. So the selective interpretation, I think, can skew the evidence, and I think that's a problem. So I take some exception, from my standpoint, when we look at the use of systematic review studies. I just don't think they're very reliable or meta analyses. It's kind of a stretch to say that, and I think ultimately, it's again, we don't know if it's a causation effect. So again, it's just something to be aware of. That maybe there's an association to it, but with systematic reviews, it's garbage in, garbage out. It depends on the underlying clinical trials that you're actually going to be looking at. Okay. One of the things that he brings up, and this I found really funny, is PBD asks him, "Why do we live longer now?" I thought it was a great question. So again, props to PBD. And Peter Gøtzsche responds that that's not his area of research. And I was like, "What? You just been talking about mortality rates and diseases, prescription drugs being the leading cause of death, and all of a sudden now it's like, oh, that's not my area of research. But you've been talking about death and diseases and bias and studies, and now all of a sudden it's not related to your background." I thought that was kind of a cop out. And then he says that his reasoning later, he says that, and this I found funny as well, that his family's generation, his parents, his grandparents, were actually heavier, more obese. They didn't exercise. They didn't eat as well. But that's false, right? That's just completely false. Obesity rates now are way, way higher than they were back, in his parents' time. To give you an idea, he is born in 1949. So, looking at the early 1900s, clearly we know that's very obvious data. That's very well documented. Obesity rates are much, much, much higher than they were back then. And again, PBD rightfully calls him out on it and says, can you kind of explain that? He was very polite about it, but that's just really false. And I credit PBD for challenging him on that misinformation. One of the examples that PBD gives is about blood thinners. He talks about one of the Home Depot founders, about how his father died at 62. And if there were blood thinners at the time, his dad might have lived longer. And PBD is right. And that's an example of medications that are life-saving rather, right? So that's very, very important. And again, there's many, like I mentioned before, all different diseases I talked about: polio, diabetes, HIV, AIDS, etc. One of the things that he discusses, and I want to leave this to the end, is Vioxx. And Vioxx, you may know, rofecoxib was a COX-2 inhibitor, cyclooxygenase 2 inhibitor that was used for arthritis, osteoarthritis, and acute pain. I know a lot about it because I was actually working at Merck, which was the maker of Vioxx, at the time when it was pulled from the market. And he talks about Vioxx and about the Vioxx scandal. There was actually an article that was written about my role, at Merck at the time, and I was involved in the scandal. I didn't do anything wrong, but at the time when I was at Merck, that scandal broke out. So I want to kind of talk about that a little bit more because it's important to understand. Prior to Vioxx and at the time Celebrex is still on the market, which was made by, which is commercialized by Pfizer. There were very minimal options for patients with arthritis. Mainly, they were using, really ibuprofen was the mainstay, and there were some other non-steroidals as well. But there weren't a lot of options. They were really tough on the stomach. So the idea was with these drugs that they didn't target the other cyclooxygenase inhibitor, which is cyclooxygenase 1, and they were only inhibiting cyclooxygenase 2, so they were able to preserve the stomach lining. And that was the idea, okay? But unfortunately, what they found, the drug worked well. I took it myself, for example, for a wisdom tooth extraction instead of taking opioids, worked phenomenal. I mean, to be honest. And again, I have nothing to gain by saying this. This drug now has been taken off the market from a long time ago. But here's the problem. There were some pharmaceutical reps that were saying to use the drug at the higher dose for more than 5 days. It was indicated for acute pain. I think it was 5 days, but they were saying to use it for at the higher dose for a month, for 2 months. And then there was some data that Merck had allegedly that they didn't share, so they weren't transparent with the data, where they knew that there were cardiovascular deaths due to Vioxx, and it was hidden. Now, what I can tell you is, I personally, in this situation, um, will say 95% of the people that I worked with, they were trying to do the right thing. They didn't knowingly or intentionally try to harm patients. I had no idea that this was happening, of course. I wasn't told to try to talk about any drug use for Vioxx off label. So he talks about it as if it's like a whole conspiracy within the company. And that just simply isn't true. Were there some bad actors at Merck? Yes. There were some bad actors that should have been more transparent with the data. But ultimately, the Vigor trial, which I think was the year 2000, revealed that there was cardiovascular events, and Merck pulled the drug off the market. So again, I think that most of the time, the drug companies are trying to do the right thing. They are trying to do the right thing. One of the things that he does talk about is how pharma cultivates key opinion leaders and how medical education is biased and corrupted. I agree with that to some degree. Pharma companies do indeed go out there and they try to cultivate key opinion leaders. That's true. 100% that's true. I agree with him. Now, is it corrupted? Is it something where we're going out there and talking and asking doctors to be off label? No, that's not something we're doing. And if we did that, again, we'd be terminated from our position. So I think what's important to understand is, in any industry, right? Banking, oil and gas, the airline industry, you're always going to have some bad actors. I mean, we had the whole situation with Boeing recently where doors were flying off the planes and there was a lot of question about quality control and things like that. At the end of the day, though, I think it comes down to making sure, if you're a company, that you have standards in place, right? That you have particular competencies and standards that you make sure your team members adhere to. And this is why I think the work we do at the ACMA is really important, because at the end of the day, you need to hold people accountable for what they do. But would I go so far as to say that the pharma industry is corrupt? No, the pharma industry is not corrupt. The pharma industry, by and large, tries to do the right thing. And I'm telling you this from experience. Again, I have nothing to gain saying this. This is just from my own observations of almost, 15, 16 years in the industry. Now, when it comes to drug pricing, because I know some of you are going to comment about drug pricing, when it comes to drug pricing, I've talked about this. One of the big reasons that pushes drug pricing to be very high really is related to what? The pharmacy benefit managers and the model that's set up in the US. Again, to President Trump's credit, he's trying to deal with this with the most favored nation policy, where he's trying to get our drug prices to be similar to other countries. There's the big beautiful bill, which had a provision actually for PBMs. It was taken out. So the Trump administration, is trying to help curb some of those issues, even with the tariffs and bringing in domestic manufacturing. Now, I know at least in the short term, it might cause some price issues, but long term, I think it's better to have more control over our manufacturing in the U.S. So that's really my take on Peter Gøtzsche. I think look, he's a physician, and I think he probably has good intentions, but I do think that he's a little misinformed in terms of really how the pharma industry works. I felt like he was kind of he had this big bad pharma corruption mindset, and it was hard for him to kind of see beyond that really the pharmaceutical industry has done a lot of good. And so I didn't want you guys listening to that podcast, if you came across it, to hear it and just think, everything that pharma does is bad. Now, I'll end with this. Are there some situations where pharma companies, have taken advantage of patients? There are, but they're rare and far few in between. Okay. Even the example, I know a lot of people sometimes will bring up the example of Martin Shkreli, who was the pharma bro, and talk about, how he raised the price of Daraprim, I don't know what it was, 3,000% or 5,000%, whatever it was, for patients that had AIDS. And, he was a monster and things like that. But I want to tell you guys something, and I'm not, supporting anything Martin Shkreli does, but here's the thing. Many companies were doing that. They just weren't getting the attention in the media. And I think he was probably given how he was carrying himself in public. He just was kind of a magnet for bad press and whatnot. But in reality, in the pharmaceutical space, we often will take products, that maybe companies haven't focused on. They're kind of B-level products. Company will acquire them and then raise the price. So I think there's a lot of sensitivity around that, and I can understand why. But the truth of the matter is that, again, for the most part, people working in the pharmaceutical industry are trying to do the right thing. I have many, many colleagues that really do care about patients and helping patients, and I've seen that firsthand. And I can say, again, by and large, people really have good intentions in mind who work in the industry. So I don't want a few bad apples to kind of ruin it for everybody. But that being said, accountability is important. Having standards are important. Having a way to vet your organization by an external body that they have the competencies, the knowledge, the expertise to go out and educate doctors. Very, very important, because ultimately you don't want to bias doctors and inform physicians incorrectly, because they need to be able to rely on objective, unbiased information. And I can tell you from myself working on drug commercials, a lot goes into making sure those commercials are fair and balanced. All right, look, if you found this video helpful, be sure to give us a thumbs up, like, comment, let us know, what you think about this topic, or any other topic that you're interested in hearing more about. All right, we'll talk to you guys soon.